Okay, so today we're going to look at a case, and it's going to leave you with some pretty serious questions about justice. So imagine you're a victim of a really horrific crime. You know those responsibles are finally convicted, and you're finally feeling like, okay, maybe things are going to be okay. You start to feel some relief, and then all of a sudden, you discover that they've been granted bail. And get this, you weren't even told about the hearing. So that's the shocking reality in an Indian criminal case that we're exploring today. And we're using the Supreme Court order from December 13th, 2024 to guide us. We're going to try to figure out what happened, why it matters, and what this means for the Indian legal system. And trust me, this case raises some pretty big questions about victims' rights and access to justice. These are issues that resonate way beyond India's borders. So let's set the scene. We're dealing with incredibly serious charges here: kidnapping, sexual assault, and violations under both the POCSO and SCST acts.
Yeah, just for our listener, those acts are really important for protecting vulnerable people, the POCSO Act. That specifically is about protecting children from sexual offenses. And then we have the SCST Act, and that's there to protect members of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes who have faced a lot of discrimination and violence historically.
Exactly. So the stakes are really high in this case. The accused are Kargesh, also known as Golu, and Karan. Now, they were convicted for these crimes, but then the High Court decided to grant them bail. And this is where things get really troubling. They did this without even informing the victim, we'll call them X, to protect their privacy, or giving them any chance to participate in the proceedings. I mean, I'm just amazed that they could just push the victim aside like that.
Yeah, you're right to be surprised. Legally, that's a big deal, a major breach. In fact, the Supreme Court, they looked at the case and called it a gross violation. And they condemned the High Court's casual and cursory manner and utter disregard for the victim's rights. I mean, those are pretty strong words.
Wow, yeah. They definitely did not mince words. So, that level of criticism from the Supreme Court, it really shows they thought this was a serious mistake. And what makes it even more concerning is that the High Court totally ignored certain legal requirements that are supposed to protect victims in these situations.
Absolutely. We're talking mandatory provisions here. These aren't just suggestions or guidelines. We're talking about Section 4391A of the Criminal Procedure Code and 15A3 of the SCST Act, which clearly state that the victim has to be informed and given a chance to participate. In any bail proceedings, I mean, think about it this way. It's basically like a judge making a major decision about your case without even letting you step into the courtroom.
Right. That's a great analogy. It really clarifies the situation, even for someone like me, who isn't a lawyer, so thankfully. The Supreme Court stepped in. They overturned the bail decision. And they ordered that the accused must surrender by December 30th, 2024. So that's just a couple of weeks away from when we're recording this. I'm kind of struck by how quickly the Supreme Court responded to this. It almost makes you wonder, if they saw how badly the High Court messed up and they wanted to fix it right away. What do you think?
I think you're exactly right. I think the Supreme Court's response, it being so swift and decisive, it really sends a strong message about how important these safeguards are. They're not just some bureaucratic hoops to jump through. They have a purpose. This case really shows what can happen when they're ignored.
It's both alarming and reassuring. It's kind of scary to think that this could even happen. But at the same time, it's good to see the Supreme Court taking such a strong stance to protect victims' rights. This whole thing makes me think about the bigger picture. What does this case tell us about how the Indian judicial system works?
That's a great question, and it brings us to a really fundamental tension. In any legal system, how do you balance the rights of the accused with the rights of the victim? In this case, the High Court's actions definitely tipped the scales too far in favor of the accused. They completely ignored the victim. It makes you wonder how often this kind of thing happens without someone like the Supreme Court stepping in.
And this isn't just some theoretical legal argument. We're talking about real people and real consequences. And it brings up so many more questions. I mean, could this be a sign of a bigger problem within the Indian judicial system? Or are there deeper issues at play, like systemic biases, that maybe contributed to this blatant disregard for the victim's rights? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, you've hit on some really crucial points. This case raises some uncomfortable questions about possible biases and whether the safeguards that are in place are actually enough to guarantee a fair and just process for everyone, especially the victims. I think it would be good to explore those questions further as we dive deeper into this case.
Definitely. Now, before we go on, I think we should break down exactly what happened in this case step by step. This will help us understand how serious this all is and set the stage for discussing the bigger implications.
Yeah, I agree. Having a clear timeline of the events, will give us some valuable context as we unpack the complexities of this case and its far-reaching consequences. Okay, so just to remind everyone, we're talking about this case with Kargesh and Karan, who were found guilty of really serious crimes like kidnapping and sexual assault, with violations under those two acts, the POCSO and SCST acts.
Right, and those acts, like we talked about earlier, they're meant to protect these really vulnerable groups,
Yeah.
children and people from marginalized communities. And it's so disturbing that even after they were convicted, the High Court granted them bail and didn't even tell the victim X or give them a chance to speak up.
It's a huge failure on like so many levels. Not only did they ignore X's rights, but they also just completely ignored these mandatory provisions. You know, the ones that are there specifically for this reason. Like they had this clear set of rules to follow and they just didn't.
I know. It's hard to believe that they could be that careless. I mean, thank goodness the Supreme Court got involved to reverse the decision. But it makes you think, how often does this happen without the Supreme Court stepping in? Are these safeguards even strong enough? If they can be so easily ignored.
That's a good point. You know the Supreme Court judgment. It's great for X and for victims' rights in general, but it also shows how easily those rights can be violated, even when the law is clear. It makes you ask, are there enough checks and balances in the system to make sure these safeguards are actually being followed?
Yeah, that's a thought. It's like having this amazing rule book, and then nobody actually uses it. What about the public prosecutor in all this? Weren't they supposed to let the victim know about the bail hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. The public prosecutor, it's their job to represent the state and to make sure the law is followed. And in this case, they really dropped the ball. I mean, this raises serious questions about accountability. Are there systems in place to handle this kind of oversight? And if not, how do we stop it from happening again?
It's scary to think that something so important could be forgotten, especially in a case like this. With such serious charges and such vulnerable victims, this lapse in responsibility, it's a big red flag. Makes me wonder if there are deeper problems here. You know, could there be biases within the system, conscious or unconscious, that led to the victim's rights being ignored?
That's a tough question.
I know.
But I think we have to ask it. When we talk about systemic biases, we're talking about how the power structures and prejudices in society can affect decision-making.
Yeah.
Even within institutions like the legal system, I mean.
Right.
Could there be societal biases against certain types of victims that made it easier to overlook X's rights in this case?
That's an unsettling thought.
Yeah, it is.
But I think we need to consider every possibility. We can't ignore the fact that these biases might have influenced the legal process. Now, we've talked a lot about the victim's rights and the failures of this system, but the accused have rights too. So where does their right to a fair trial come into all of this?
That's really important. Anytime we talk about justice, we have to make sure everyone's rights are protected, including the accused. They have the right to due process, to have a lawyer, and to be considered innocent until proven guilty. It's the basis of a just system.
So how do we balance all of this? Protecting the rights of the accused, but also making sure victims like X aren't ignored or silenced. Seems like walking a tightrope.
Yeah, it is. This case really shows how hard it can be. We need systems that hold people responsible for their actions while also ensuring a fair process and protecting the basic rights of everyone involved, no matter what their role is in the case.
It's like a puzzle where all the pieces are connected. And if you move one, it affects everything else. In this case, it makes you think about access to justice. I mean, the legal system, it can be so confusing, even for people who know how it works and have resources.
Yeah. Think about the victim in this case. They've already been through so much trauma. And then they have to deal with this system. That's more like an obstacle course than a way to get justice. It really highlights that not everyone has equal access to justice. It can depend on things like how much money you have, your education level, even where you live.
Suppose use this complicated situation, all these challenges.
Yeah.
Is there anything to feel hopeful about, honestly? I'm starting to feel overwhelmed by all of this.
I get it. The problems we're talking about, they're really deep. But I do think there's reason to be optimistic. The fact that the Supreme Court stepped in, it shows that the system can fix itself, that there are ways to address injustice.
Yeah, that's true. It does give you some hope. To see the Supreme Court taking such strong action to protect the victims' rights, it shows that they're willing to hold people in power accountable and to try to make the system more just.
Right. Hopefully cases like this one can lead to bigger changes. Maybe a review of the procedures, better training for people working in the system, even new laws to better protect victims.
That would be a great outcome. To take this horrible situation and use it to make real change in the legal system. It's amazing how this one case with all its twists and turns, has uncovered so many issues.
Yeah, it really has. And now that we've opened this box, we can't just ignore it. We need to keep talking about these problems, keep looking closely at the system, and keep pushing for real change.
I totally agree. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about the legal stuff, but we can't forget that behind all of this, there's a real person who's been deeply affected by all of this. Let's try to understand their story.
Yeah, that's important. It's easy to get lost in the legal details, but at the end of the day, this is about someone who has experienced real trauma.
Yeah.
And who almost had their voice taken away by the system.
Exactly. Let's try to imagine what X went through. Think about it. You experience this horrible crime, then you finally get a conviction, you start to feel some relief, and then bam, you find out the people who hurt you have been granted bail. And you didn't even know about it.
It must have been devastating.
I know.
To feel like you were betrayed by the very system that was supposed to be protecting you. The fear, the anxiety, the feeling of being powerless. I can't even imagine.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It really shows that the legal system needs to be more trauma-informed. We have to recognize the emotional impact of these proceedings on victims.
Yeah.
And give them the support and resources they need throughout the whole process.
Sure. It's not just about what the law says. It's about human dignity and empathy. We need to make sure that victims feel safe, heard, and respected within the legal system.
Right, and that they have a voice, not that they're silenced.
Yeah.
This case brings up another important issue, the impact on society as a whole. I mean, this didn't happen in a bubble. It's part of a conversation in India and around the world.
About justice, accountability, and protecting vulnerable groups. Absolutely. How this case is handled, how the legal system responds. It sends a message to everyone. It affects how people see justice. And it can influence whether other victims feel safe coming forward or whether they stay silent because they're afraid of being ignored or re-traumatized by the system.
That's a scary thought.
It is.
If the system fails to protect victims and doesn't hold the people who committed the crimes accountable, it creates this climate of fear and distrust, and it makes it harder for justice to be done.
Exactly. It can make people lose faith in the system, send the message that these crimes aren't taken seriously, and even make the perpetrators feel like they can get away with it. But when the system works the way it should, when victims' rights are protected, and the people who did wrong face consequences, it shows everyone that justice is possible.
It sets an example, establishes norms, and shapes how society sees what's acceptable and what's not.
Right. In this case, even with all the bad things about it, it also shows that things can change for the better. The Supreme Court took a strong stand to defend the victims' rights, and that's a powerful message. It shows that people in power are willing to fight for those who are vulnerable and challenge injustice.
It's a reminder that even in flawed systems, there's still hope for progress, and we need to keep holding on to that hope and keep pushing for a fairer legal system for everyone. Now, before we move on to the last part, I want to point out one more thing about this case that I think is really relevant to what we're talking about today. You know, this whole situation has really made me think about what justice even means. Is it just about punishment, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, that's a deep question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. It's something people have been trying to figure out forever. You know, if we look at this case, the Supreme Court's decision to overturn the bail, that's definitely a step towards justice, legally speaking. But does it really fix the harm that was done to the victim? Does it help them heal? Or give them a sense of closure?
I don't know. It really makes you think about the limits of the law.
Wow.
You know, can the legal system really deal with all the complexities of human suffering and the need for things to be made right?
We tend to focus on punishment when we talk about justice. But what about rehabilitation for both the person who committed the crime and the victim? And how do we prevent these things from happening in the first place?
Those are such important parts of justice, and they often get ignored. It's like we're so busy reacting to the harm that's already been done that we forget to try and stop it from happening again.
Exactly. We need to look at this more broadly and recognize how everything is connected. The legal stuff, the social stuff, the psychological stuff. It's about dealing with the root causes of crime, helping victims to heal, and creating a culture of accountability and respect.
This case has been such a clear example of how one event can reveal all these bigger issues. It's made me realize that justice isn't just something legal. It's a value that should be part of everything we do.
I agree. And it's a value that we have to be really careful with and always work to improve. We can't just rely on laws and procedures. We need to create a society that values empathy, fairness, and the well-being of everyone.
That's a really powerful takeaway. It reminds us that we all have a part to play in making the world a fairer place. Whether it's through advocating for better laws, supporting groups that work with victims, or even just challenging harmful attitudes and behaviors in our own communities.
Right. Everything we do, even the small things, can help create a more equitable and compassionate society. It's about understanding that justice isn't some end goal. It's a constant journey.
This has been such an eye-opening discussion,
It has.
and honestly, pretty heavy at times. But I think it's so important to have these conversations, to face the difficult stuff, and to really question what we believe.
Definitely. We can't avoid the tough topics. This case has shown us some of the problems in the Indian legal system, but it's also started a really important conversation about how we can make things better and how we can create a system that delivers justice for everyone.
And I hope our listeners will keep that conversation going. Think about what justice means to you and what you can do to help make the world a fairer place. These are tough questions,
They are.
but they're worth asking.
It's been great to break down this case with you and to explore these important ideas with our listeners.
Thanks for sharing your knowledge and insights. This has been a really thought-provoking discussion. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's made you think and given you a better understanding of how important it is to have these critical conversations. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep working towards a more just and equitable world.